This presentation is building on last year's presentation to the collective, focusing on the multifaceted definition for out-of-field teaching. So this time we're actually presenting on the definition that we've developed. The need for a definition for out-of-field arises because of the fact that there's no single definition of what makes a teacher out-of-field internationally or even within a country. But ultimately it's about assigning teachers to teach subjects they're not qualified to teach. The need to have a clear definition is because it's both a complex phenomenon, so you want to capture the complexity of the phenomenon within that definition so that it's not just being in or out of field, but also in a way that meets the needs of the different stakeholders that are responsible for dealing with it. And part of that it requires understanding the current profile of teachers in the system. That's one reason you would have a clear definition. Looking at the distribution of teacher workforce, understanding the teachers and the teaching practices of those who are in those teaching in that context. Looking at school leadership practices that might lead to teachers teaching out of field, but also how they support teachers. And then looking at it from a system approach, how resources being allocated and how might that be informed by the information that arises through the definition that you create. So you can look at the complexity in terms of the teacher experience and their expertise, of the school context and the leadership, also the state regulations that lead to that make a teacher out of field or determines what in-field and out-of-field means, and also look at the varying impacts according to those different people. So what we did, recognising that complexity, we wanted to look at which aspects of the out-of-field phenomenon need to be included in a definition of teaching out of field suitable for a particular context. And what I've presented this in a number of locations, and something that's interesting for me is thinking about how can what we've developed in terms of definition support international collaboration to research in this area. So in terms of our what we did, it's basically a literature review. And we had multiple sources. Chris did a lot of the literature search and use those particular parameters there. I don't really want to sort of refer to those in detail, so we can come back to that perhaps. But what we did come up with was different qualification, thinking around two subcategories basically. One was around matching between qualifications and teaching allocation and how that was referred to and defined. And some sub-themes or subcategories that came up related to practices and policies around initial teacher education and how teachers entered the teaching degree. One was looking at discipline and teacher qualifications. One was looking at registration or certification. In Victoria, we talk about registration. Specialism and the issues around multiple disciplines, so or multidisciplinary subjects like humanities or even science, and then differentiation along those lines, year level, subject level, school context, etc. And then looking at the types, so different types of out-of-fieldness, different types of identity standings, commitments, what field means, the notion of suitability, what does suitability mean, and then looking at role and phase. So some of that language we've actually picked up in putting together a number of criteria that you can use to make judgments about somebody as to whether they're out of field or not. So we came up with 3 groups, and the criteria are represented in dimensions and bands, and we've come up with a multi-definition because we didn't think that qualification on its own was necessarily going to be useful in all situations.
So these, I'm going to go through this quickly because we did talk about this last year, and they haven't changed an awful lot. So these are the criteria. One relating to qualification. So what's a teacher qualified to teach? And these are different dimensions of that. One looking at technical alignment, that the qualification matches what they're teaching. Specialism alignment refers to the teacher, if there's a particularly multidisciplinary subject, whether, you know, teaching geography is the same as teaching history, for example. And phase alignment, which is the school type level, so primary, secondary. Workload allocation, looking at the proportionality of the out of field, what happens over time, and the stability of that load. And then capability, looking at the expertise of the teacher, and also thinking about the career stage, what's important at different career stages. Ideas around identity, so what does a teacher identify as, and you can see the terms we're looking at there. And then structure, so how do, and these are school type structures that mediate teacher learning. So school context and the school culture of support. The last one is pathways. It's a little bit different to the others, but looking at how can a teacher become out of field, or what trajectories are there, and what happens for the teacher in terms of their role expansion. So they're the criteria. A quick look through those, and this is how we've put it together by looking at, so this is one criteria, capability. We looked at what are the assumptions based on the literature. We've got standards of operation, and I think these are really important to be clear about what we want teachers to look like. If we want a teacher to become in field, what are we looking for? And then for each of the dimensions, there's bands. So band 1 being most aligned and band 3 being least aligned. And you can use these, I guess, as ways to make judgments about how teachers are with each of these criteria. So that was just for one of them. But what I'm going to show you is all of the criteria and their dimensions and bands. But I'm going to talk about it in terms of what could be transferred from one jurisdiction to another. And then, but then what needs to be translated, and what's context specific, that if we were going to take this definition into another location, what thinking or adjustment needs to be made. So these are all of the measurable criteria. These are the 3 that I showed you before. These are the standards, and these are the various dimensions associated with those that I introduced you to. And then these are the bands. Band 1 meaning most aligned, band 3 meaning least aligned. So in terms of translation, so what needs to be translated? Certainly the specialist area guidelines, what makes a teacher specialised to teach needs to be translated. And that's quite clear already, the way Jim was talking about clear certification, whereas other countries don't have that. What's teaching qualification and how important is that in different contexts? We've already seen some differences there in how the role that the teaching qualification plays, but that can determine what phase of school they're teaching, and that differs across countries. Certification, approval, registration processes clearly differ. Specialisms and how these align with the school curriculum. We don't have a subject called Algebra 1 in Australia, you know, it's called maths in Australia. How specialism in that context is quite different, I think. So, and then you got phase in terms of preparation and implications for out of field. Certainly in Germany, you know, they talk about primary teachers teaching out of field because they don't really get exposure to much of the other, to a lot of disciplines, only some, which is quite different in Australia, which is why we can talk about teachers as generalists, although technically probably not really good at maths and some other subjects. So what can be transferred? Probably workload and proportions, probably ideas around capability in terms of expertise, effects of relationship to career stage, and risks associated with that misalignment. I think those things are relatively transferable, and we can have common language around that. Then we've got the self-report criteria, identity and structures. Probably what needs translation are the policies for supporting new teachers. So in some countries, what support do teachers have in their graduate year? Are they still associated with the university that they've come out with? Are they given a reduced timetable in order to be able to teach effectively? And then the notion of school autonomy and funding arrangements, that's quite different across different jurisdictions, and that really does play into the capacity for schools to make decisions. And then and there's various examples from around the world that shows positive and negative for that school autonomy. Then you've probably got transferable characteristics like teacher identity factors and school context as support structures. While there's probably differences in how schools might do it and approach it, I suspect there would be some common language around that. But probably, I mean, Rafaela and I have done some interesting comparisons across Australia and Germany, and there are some differences in terms of what's there, but generally I think fairly similar. And then the pathways one, I think, is a big one. There's only two things here, but really, are there pathways available for teachers? And in terms of formal qualifications and professional learning, and the mechanisms for recognising that in terms of approval or certification. We have differences in just across states in Australia on that, in that, you know, you have accredited professional learning in some states, but not in others. Expectations for what's considered in field. That probably goes back to that earlier question around policy, but that notion of suitability and fit. I think to some extent the notion of suitability and fit, which is a principal judgment, is probably transferable in that principals or schools make judgment around, you seem suitable, so we'll put you in there. Then we've got cultural expectations for being qualified. That differs enormously. So whether a country feels that a teacher needs to be qualified once you're in there, hi Fiona, then that I think is a big one. What's transferable is probably the notion of acceptance of role and identity expansion once you do sort of go down that path. So quite a few, I think it's interesting to look at these things. I'm going to put in the chat while we're talking the document that we use to generate these, if you're interested. But other aspects within that, I've got 1 minute, is some clear definitions for in-field and for out-of-field. So there were 4 different out-of-field definitions. One was based around qualification, standard. One based around specialism, which it comes back to that multidisciplinary subject. One relates to workload. So that, and this was inspired by Sam's presentation last year, that notion of in-field, out-of-field and partially, whereas you'll notice that I've got 4 instead of 3 measures there, but that how is workload contributing, making someone feel out of field? And then the other one is, it comes back to that idea of capability. Are they capable of doing it? And there's pathways implications for those 3, but not so much the workload. The way it's set up is that here's the definition, here's the bands, and the definitions are based on various measures. So the capability one looks at capability and risk. So the notion of capability and risk came up as 2 important factors. And so the bands and dimensions are set up to identify which of those points are relevant. You know, if you're making a judgment in terms of capability and risk, where would that fit? So, so you can see that moving up there. Along with that is some scenarios that we put together to illustrate how this language might be used to characterize the teachers. Now, Jim, you're not going to like, I know you don't like it, because I'm talking about teachers who are out of field rather than the fact that there's out of field teaching going on. And that is an issue that I have too with this to some extent. But what it has done is highlight, I suppose, the notion of, it comes down to the idea of alignment, it comes down to the notion of capability, and also brings into the mix the notion of risk, which also came out of last year's symposium. Helen Watt used that word, so I borrowed that from her. So that's it. Sorry, I've gone a little bit over time, but I will put the document into the chat because it may become useful for people for tomorrow. Thank you.